Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Tiki Goth. I'm like, is there a bug in my ear or something like that? Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Tiki Goth Club. This is my co-host, Jamie.
Hi.
And this is our good friend, Sveinn. And Sveinn, if you don't know, he's a famous photographer. You're starting your clothing line called, what's it called?
Tropikvlt.
Tropikvlt. And as you see, that's what does that say? Girls just want to have rum?
That's right.
It's true.
It's true.
Sveinn is from Iceland.
Yep.
And you are also a metalhead.
That's right.
And it's a lot of the metal you listen to would be, was it like death metal?
Yeah, death metal, black metal, industrial. I love goth metal as well, and that's kind of what we're talking about. Is
goth metal.
Yeah.
So what? Well, first of all, can metal be goth?
Well,
or is that a redundant term?
I think goth can be metal, not metal can be goth.
What do you mean?
So goth itself, like to me, like we were just talking about this, is like to me goth splits off into two weird categories. You got like the pop, and then you have the metal, right? And like we were just talking about that earlier, is like when I was in Iceland back in like late 80s, early 90s, like goth wasn't Bauhaus. Goth was like weird industrial goth, because we got some of the European influence over there before we got the American influence of goth.
Yeah.
So we got all of the more metal industrial, goth stuff before we got the pop goth stuff. And pop is like a weird, I'm not trying to like label it as like happy goth, but
no, I understand what you're saying.
It's a little more like just a different kind of beat to it. So, and that was what we're talking about, is like because we're in like the same age category and the same, like the music came out at the same time, but like what I heard and what you heard at the same time was completely different. Yeah. So like I was like mid 90s, early 90s, like I was like really into like Theater of Tragedy and like Therion and like just like the heavier, like more sludgy, metal goth stuff. And like back then, like you had different music coming out in the US than we had, and we didn't get that until much later. Like we didn't get Manson until like mid to late 90s. Then we started getting Manson over there, and like I was super into Manson at the time, and I loved it, and it was different. Completely different, like how we had it there versus what you guys had.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're nailing it on the head. I mean, if you're going to say like pop goth, pop means popular.
Popular, yeah.
And
pop isn't really a sound.
Yeah.
It's more like
Popular.
how user friendly is it?
And back in the 80s, you had MTV, and MTV really, really dictated to a lot of people the music that you're getting pushed at. So for a lot of people, goth was like The Cure or Bauhaus or whatever it was.
Yep.
The Cure being the biggest thing that we're talking about, because it was like, I mean, you think of like a dark, gloomy music.
Yeah, they were like the dark corner of the room. You know what I'm
Okay,
saying?
but do you want to know the song that got me into The Cure?
What's that?
As I think
By
I
all
was
means.
in 6th grade.
What's that?
I was in 6th or 7th grade. Was Just Like Heaven.
Yeah.
And so I
That
was
was their
like a
biggest
little
hit.
middle school girl. Like my friends were listening to New Kids on the Block, and I was like, I like this song Just Like Heaven. And then like that was my introduction to The Cure, and that was like full on a radio hit.
Yeah.
Like I think my mom probably heard it on the radio. I mean,
There wasn't much, but it's like back in the 80s, like metal was Iron Maiden and Priest.
Yeah.
Thrash music, which is what I love, wasn't very popular in the mainstream. Industrial. I think the first industrial video I saw was like Ministry.
Yeah,
That's like
I feel like Europe had
89.
better industrial earlier than America did.
Yeah, so you had it going on earlier, and you had access to it. But as far as America is concerned, that was slowly being trickled in. But
Well, yeah, and that makes sense though, because I would see like KMFDM as being they're kind of one of the grandfathers of industrial, because they like kind of made this shit as like an
we had
art
Wump's
project.
Cut. Like that was
And
our
they were from Germany.
Yeah.
But then they moved here, and it was like in Wax Trax, like in Chicago, is like kind of the filter for everything, even that was coming from Europe. That's kind of who filtered European industrial to us Americans.
One thing I notice about a lot of the European metal bands, they're all about wearing the makeup. Where does that come from?
I don't know,
in costuming.
I mean, it's like full on.
It's just
like they're really about the look and the image.
I feel like we're touching on a subject there, which actually touches on the tiki thing.
Go.
So the whole idea of like escapism and getting into your environment and be like, this is my environment. This is where I love to be. And I think that's where it comes from. Is like they just wanted to embody the feeling that they had. And just the same thing as like when you go, you make your own tiki bar and you're in your whole environment. It's like the tiki bar is on the outside, corpse paint on the inside, sort of thing. You know what I mean? So it's like you.
What did you just say? Tiki bar on the outside, corpse.
But it's like
corpse paint on the inside.
You just kind of embody what it is that you really enjoy. You know what I mean? So for them, it was dressing up the way that they want to dress up, and that's why I really see that distinction between the goth is like the pop and the metal side. The metal side was like you had that injection of black metal from Scandinavia into the goth scene over there, and the goth scene really picked that up, like the really heavy eyeliner, the really like white face stuff.
Yeah,
it's like a performance art aspect of it.
And that's what we had. Like we had a lot of that sort of aesthetic to it, which is amazing. It's super sexy. But America didn't really have that until later.
No, not at all. I mean, it's like I'm thinking about like the bands that I like say in the 80s, like Slayer, Metallica, Megadeth. A lot of those bands were wearing ripped jeans and Reeboks.
Well, I mean, we can talk about Kiss. Kiss was like one of the original, like, hey, let's paint our faces, with the two-tone sort of thing. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, but they weren't talking about goth topics. They were talking about love guns and Dr. Loves and stuff.
The girl's named Beth.
Yeah. The girl's named Beth. But a lot of the metal bands from America, they looked metal. Maybe they had the leather jackets and the spikes. But one word I would not describe them is goth. Right. But a lot of the bands from overseas, oh hell yeah. And that's the first word that would come to my mind.
But I think that comes from the Scandinavian black metal industrial stuff. Like I think that trickled into the goth scene there and became like the darker feel, you know what I mean? Which is in America, like their darker feel was more about like the words and what they're trying to convey, versus over in Europe it was more about like the aesthetic of what you're trying to convey. So
and that actually, like if I just look at this from a historical perspective, makes sense because like European circus, for example, is very much like beautiful performance art, whereas what the word circus that we use here is different, so just in putting together that whole like you said, the scenario and like beautiful paint and all of that, like it all kind of, it makes sense that sort of artistry would have come into their music as well in a different way than here.
So you may be asking yourself, how can I join the Tiki Goth Club? Well, there is no membership, there are no fees, but I have shirts for sale. They're $20 a piece, $5 shipping and handling. If you're interested, go to my website, tikiwithray.com. There's a prompt that says buy a shirt, follow that, and then that's how you can get your own. Is there any American goth metal bands? Would you consider any of them?
Typo Negative.
Yeah, okay. So there you go. Yep.
We'll talk Typo Negative.
Yeah, all right, there you go. I agree.
Typo Negative was like one of the giant turning points of people looking at goth differently. To me, anyway.
How so?
They didn't have the corpse paint, but they had the musical motif of turning things in a vampirical, undead goth. And that was metal in itself.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And a lot of their music was metal. Let's just face it.
Oh yeah, they're a metal band. There's nothing else I could call.
But they had like molded together, and when you go back to like their first couple albums of like. It wasn't the slower stuff they had later.
Yeah.
It was like the crazy thrash, almost thrash stuff. And they were mixing together the aesthetic of Europe and the metal of Europe with the kind of pop direction of America. And I think that they're one of the first bands to like really mix the two together and say, okay, well, now we're mainstream. And they just they ran with it. They really did run with it. And it was interesting to watch how people... in Iceland, they were like, typo who? Like, I don't understand, like, well, they don't look metal, so why would I listen to them? And it wasn't until, like, they started getting into the music, that they started getting the feel for it, and they're like, oh, this is slower, but it has like a darker feel to it. So, and that was the thing, is I felt like the Europeans wanted something a little more angry sounding, and the Americans wanted something a little more like uplifting sounding, but still sad. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And they were one of the few that were managing to mix the two together, and that's why, like, one of the reasons why they were so popular, like on both sides of the ocean on that one.
You were saying about Marilyn Manson.
Uh-huh.
Let's. Here's the question: is Marilyn Manson goth?
Oh gosh.
Would you say?
I would say that probably most people who consider themselves goth would consider him to be part of their sphere.
I feel like you have to go back to which album are you talking about? Because if you say...
You're talking Antichrist Superstar. Obviously...
That was the big turning point, but...
His later stuff, he almost kind of went David Bowie glammy in a weird way. With
Right, was it...
Like, I like the drugs with the drugs like me.
Yeah,
that album.
Popular Mechanics or whatever, what the fuck it was.
Popular Mechanics!
But Antichrist Superstar was like the giant turning point, and that happened. A lot of things happened to that album. First, number one, Trent Reznor. That's what made that album. Period.
Oh, well, there you go.
Without Trent Reznor, that album would not have been so good. It just gave it that deep, dark feel, like, because the work that he did with Nine Inch Nails put into Antichrist Superstar made that album. But before that, though, that's the thing, is like, before that album, I feel like it wasn't directly goth. It was like a precursor, like a sort of like industrial metal sort of thing, and then the aesthetic caught on, and then it became a metal goth. I think that's what, to me, like, personally, I feel like that's what happened. I love that album. Like, that is like still one of my favorite albums to date, is Antichrist Superstar.
But I think you're laying something out that I think is a very, very important thing to bring, is like, you could be an industrial band and be goth. You could be a metal band and be goth. But just because you're industrial, or just because you're a metal band, doesn't necessarily make you goth. The goth is a part that needs to be, you have to go that direction.
It's
Just
like a flavor that's sprinkled with those other things.
It's like smoked paprika. You either have it or you don't. You know?
No, I mean, like, when I used to go dancing back in the early 90s, there was a lot of industrial music. Mm-hmm. And KMFDM and Revco and all this other shit. But, I mean, there's a lot of music that I dance to. Like, if you start breaking down the individual bands, like, well, yeah, the Revolting Cocks aren't really goth.
At all.
But you're at a lot of times you're at a dance club, and half the people there are dressed goth anyway. Yeah. A lot of times that's where you went, because that's the only place you're going to have any...
Well, that was the thing, is like, when I lived in London back in 2001, 2004, in that time span there, we had goth clubs that weren't goth clubs. They were more industrial, and that's kind of what they identified with. They identified with the industrial rather than the goth. But everyone there dressed like what you would consider goth.
Yep, that's exactly the situation.
The high shoes, like the dark makeup, the leather and the pleather and the vinyl and like all this other, like that whole aesthetic is, I love that aesthetic. I absolutely love it. The thing is that in Europe, that was what was considered goth industrial, essentially. Yep. And during that time period, like right after 2004, 2005, it started waning off a bit. But that was like the giant movement during that time, is like the transition from goth traditional to goth metal. Yep. And the goth industrial was like part of that movement. And I think that the aesthetic behind goth is different than the music behind goth. I think it's two separate things. Okay. I honestly do. And I think that the people that were dressing goth would listen to various other... It's not like they were locked into one type of music.
Yeah, and again,
a lot of it's just wearing a whole lot of black.
Yeah.
Fiona Apple is a great example. Fiona Apple is it's a weird tangent. Just bear with me.
Yeah, I'm following.
So Fiona Apple, like Tidal, is one of my favorite albums with her. But that falls in the same sort of like mental capacity as goth. It has like this really sad and sullen and like just an undertone of sadness, right? And I think that's really what goth comes from to me, is the undertone of sadness and melancholy. And this isn't necessarily
when
about...
when I first got into it as a teenager back in the early 90s, that's what I identified.
Right, exactly. It's the melancholy. It's the overwhelming sadness that comes with it. I mean, if you want to put a word, depression is like the big word, right? It's like the elephant in the room. But like for me,
like real depression, like people dealing with depression.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that was like a big thing. Like we didn't have back then, like when we were growing up, we didn't have like, oh, let's just talk about it, you know? It's like, no, we're going to drink it until we're dead, you know? But I think that's like one of the big turning things about goth is like goth isn't necessarily about the makeup or the music. It's about how do you feel when you hear it? How do you feel like core wise? How do you identify with it? And that's me, like that's what it all is, really.
Well, and I know, like, you know, we're talking about, like, mixing, you know, like, the fashion of goth and the music of goth and like, with clubs and stuff, like, the club that I used to go to back in the early to mid-90s.
Here?
That was here in Portland, called The City. It was the gay club. It was the underage gay club, but then there was, like, stairs that you'd go up on the side and you'd go into this other room, and that was, like, the goth industrial room. And so, like, that's where I would go.
That's cool.
So everybody there's wearing all black, and they would play, like, you know, gothy stuff, but then they'd also play Revco.
Yep.
You know, you'd listen, you'd hear Typo Negative there.
And then, like, the same floor?
You'd hear Revco there on the same floor.
Oh my God.
You'd hear Ministry, you'd hear Bauhaus, you'd hear Sisters, you'd hear Susie.
That's crazy, I love it.
You'd hear, like, whatever, you know, other, like, industrial shit, KMFDM, whatever, like, all in the same space. It was literally our only club that had this going on.
And this is Portland.
This is Portland.
So this is a major city.
This is a major city.
And still there's one...
What year was that?
So this would have been between, like I was frequenting it from about 90 to 96.
Wow.
And it's interesting because even for people from here, some people will call that space the other side, and some people will call that space the Holly Rock. And so, like, different, like, it was a black door, and it said the other side on it. But it had two different names, but we're all talking about the same place. But it was really our only, like, gothy place to go. But then, like, I, you know, went to a lot of live shows then. As far as clothing goes, I would wear whatever the same types of things that I would wear to the club would be the same type of thing that I'd wear when I went to see Love and Rockets, or when I went to see KMFDM, or when I went to see, who else would I have seen back there? Peter Murphy, or the Cramps. I would have been wearing the same type of clothing all around because it wasn't just one thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know, like, sometimes I might goth it up a little bit with some frill or whatever, but, you know, like, for the most part,
like
the clothes
Victorian
were kind of interchangeable, you know? Like the little books, the little flip book of outfits, you know?
I'll tell you what, everything you just said, and I'm going to bring this all together and bring it back to Tiki, which is, if there's any message that we're trying to give you, viewers at home, is this: that don't Tiki or goth or whatever, you shouldn't pigeonhole it into this, or this. Open yourself up and allow yourself to be into different things all at the same time.
Mix it all together.
Mix it all together.
Be a hoe.
Because just like you said, and just like even back when I was going out dancing and stuff like that, it wasn't just industrial or it wasn't just goth. And at the same time, I mean, if you want to get down to it, at the same time I was going out dancing to KMFDM, I was in a New York hardcore band, New York style hardcore band. I was listening to punk rock. I was listening to Slayer. So it isn't like I gave up one type of music or gave up one thing and started another one. It's everything. And still, even to this day, I'm into Tiki. I love this stuff. You both are. But it isn't like we gave up any of the other stuff we've always did. So fly your goth flag.